literary princess, and today I have the next installment of my What I Read for my PhD in English Literature series. So we are up to my second year now, and the first semester, fall of 2020. So the first class that I took that semester was called Reading in All Directions, Comics and Graphic Narrative. And honestly, other than the courses that I actually took in my specific area, my Victorian Gothic class and my independent study, which we will be discussing later, this was my favorite class. I loved this class so much. Unfortunately, I did not keep many of the books from it, and I really wish I did now, but I thought I had sent them to my parents, but I hadn't, or I did with a few. So unfortunately, I only have 2 physical ones to show you, which is a bummer because, of course, they're graphic novels, so they're illustrated and they're beautiful, but oh well. So let's jump in. So for this class, we had several short papers, 3 presentations, and then 1 final paper. I will talk about the short papers and the presentations as they come up, and I will talk about my final paper at the end. The first thing that we read is My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Volume 1 by Emile Ferris. This was stunning. What a way to start off the semester. Holy crap. This follows a young girl in the 1960s named Karen who is obsessed with horror films and monsters, and the book is actually framed as like her kind of diary and sketchbook that she keeps. And she has a neighbor who is a Holocaust survivor. So we have this dual narrative. We have Karen in the 60s dealing with not feeling like she fits in, and then some issues with her brother. And then we have her neighbor, Anka, who is the Holocaust survivor, and we have her story of what happened to her during World War II and the Holocaust. I loved this book, and I'm mad I didn't keep it. I thought the drawings were absolutely gorgeous. I thought the story was really engaging. It's only volume 1. There's supposed to be volume 2, and I don't think it's come out yet, which is really a bummer, but I enjoyed this one so much. So we did have to write a paper on this one, and I chose to focus on Ferris's use of the color blue throughout. So most of the drawings are either black and white or they're in very realistic colors, except there are some people throughout who are drawn with blue skin. And this includes Anka. And Karen, the character, says of this, she wasn't actually blue, but she always looked as if she might start crying at any minute. So I argued that blue is used in 2 ways. It's used to signify a character who has been through trauma, but it's also used to signify a character who, because of that trauma, is capable of some kind of violence. There is a lot about violence in this book, as you might expect, and it's always people who have been traumatized then hurting other people because of their own trauma. So I was exploring that. I called it Mapping Blue in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, which is a pretty good title if I do say so. So in the first week, I also gave a presentation. Now we had 2 different types of presentations. We had to give 2 presentations on the actual graphic narratives we were reading, but we also had to give 1 presentation on a work of criticism that was somehow related to that week's graphic narrative. So I went first, and I had to present on Ethics in the Gutter, Empathy and Historical Fiction in Comics by Kate Polak. So I only had to read a little bit of this. I read the introduction and the first 2 chapters, and Polak's argument is basically that about how graphic narratives can display historical atrocity and engage readers' empathy and identification, or choose to distance the reader from the historical atrocity by deciding on what is shown in the visuals and what is left in the gutter, which is the space between the images. So I talked about that. I know that I used examples that Pollack drew on from Watchmen, which had a sexual assault scene, and Dio Gradias, which is about the Rwandan genocide. And I then had to provide discussion questions for how we could connect this to My Favorite Thing is Monsters. So as mentioned in my paper, My Favorite Thing is Monsters has several very violent things happen in it, including sexual assault, murder, character death, and some of these are not actually portrayed or fully portrayed. So I asked, how can we apply Pollack's series to this? Is Ferris making us complicit in the violence by having us imagine it? Is she highlighting the role of bystanders who can't know something about the experience due to not having it? And then I asked, how does Ferris position us through her use of point of view? Does she place us as bystanders, or does she allow us to see through the character's eyes? So it was a really interesting secondary source. I wish I could have read all of it, but you know, time is a thing. And it was the first week of classes. And also I borrowed the book from my professor. I needed to give it back to her. So that was week one. Wow, week one had a lot. The next book that we read was Incog Negro by Matt Johnson and Warren Cleese. So this is again historical fiction. It's set in the early 20th century and focused on a man named Zane Pinchback. He is a Black reporter. I believe he's from the North, like New York, or he lives in New York. But he is actually able to pass as white. And he uses this to go down into the South and report on lynchings that are occurring. So he is Incog Negro, as the title says. And he ends up needing to go to see about a murder that his brother has been convicted of. I believe they're twins. It was so good, but it was also very upsetting. There were some pretty upsetting visuals in this one. Speaking of ethics and what we're showing and not showing. So I also had to write a paper on this one, and I was focusing on this kind of doubling and foiling that Johnson and Cleese do. And I was specifically focusing on these two female characters, Michaela and Frances. So there are multiple doubles and foils within this book. So Zane has another character, Carl, who's also able to pass as white, and they both are trying to infiltrate Southern society, but they have very different ways of going about it. We have Zane and his twin brother Alonzo, so one can pass as white and one can't. And then we have Michaela and Frances. Doubles because the body of Frances is found and everybody thinks it's Michaela. So we have this case of mistaken identity. They look a lot alike, same age, same height, and neither of them adheres to society's standards for women. Michaela is considered a loose woman, and Frances is actually disguised herself as a man to become I think the deputy sheriff or something, like to get into law enforcement. So I was looking at the way this doubling works and what the purpose of that was in this story that is very concerned with identity. The next book that we read was Hotc Comb by Ebony Flowers. So this is a book of short stories, which it seems are based on things that Flowers experienced or people she knew experienced. They are not connected, but they are all about Black women's experience with their hair. So there's one about a young girl getting her first perm. There is one about a girl whose white friends are like always wanting to touch her hair, and it results in her having this kind of compulsion to actually pull out her hair. So this was really interesting. We did not have to write a paper on it, but what's really interesting is that the next year, so not the year I was taking this class, but the year after, Ebony Flowers actually did a Zoom talk at our school. So that was really fun to get to hear about how she works, and she did some like drawing exercises with us, and it was really fun. So the next one was Paying the Land by Joe Sacco. This is a work of nonfiction, and it is focused on the Dene people, who are an indigenous group in Canada. And Sacco actually went up to where they live and was interviewing them to find out about their history, what's going on with them now. There is a lot of issues about fracking. The Dene people are very kind of polarized on whether they support fracking or don't support fracking. It's causing issues amongst the community. This book deals a lot with what happened at the residential schools and kind of how it's began this process of kind of trying to destroy their culture, and also the process of trying to bring their culture back. This was another one of my favorites of the class. I really loved Sacco's artwork. It was a gorgeous book too. I'm like, why did I get rid of it? Damn it. But I did both a paper and a presentation on this one. My paper was focused on Sacco's use of frames and panels in the book, and it was called Breaking the Circle, the use of frames and panels in Paying the Land. So when Sacco is depicting the Dene people living in their traditional way prior to the residential schools and the fracking and all of that came in, he uses very minimal panels, and the lines that he does use are very thin. And one of the men that he interviewed actually described their community as a circle. And I noticed that when the Dene are portrayed in the book in their traditional way, like it seems like a circle, the way that he has drawn it. However, once colonization begins to happen, we see lots of panels. Whereas parts of the book that show the traditional way of living like flow very nicely, the rest of the book is very choppy and fractured. So I just thought that was really cool, and I wanted to write a paper on it, so I did. The presentation kind of was, I guess, jumped off that. I called it At the Center of the Circle, Residential Schools at the Center Point of Joe Sacco's Paying the Land. And so this presentation was really about how Sacco kind of traces all the trauma and difficulties of the Dene community back to the residential schools. And we don't actually talk about the residential schools until the exact midway point of the book. So my presentation was arguing that he has placed this at the center because he sees it as the center of the Dene people's trauma. So the next book that we read was called Nunavik by Michelle Hellman. And this was in stark contrast to Paying the Land. So both of these deal with men who are not Indigenous going into the areas of Indigenous peoples and observing. And my class found that Paying the Land was super respectful, and the focus of the book was on the Dene people. Nunavik, we found, was really just, it was used as a backdrop. So this is also nonfiction. It's about Hellman going to Nunavik and, going around there. But we found that it was all just focused on kind of him and like his experience as a white Canadian man. And we really weren't big fans of this one. I became like even less of a fan of it after our conversation in class, because we were comparing the two, and we're just like, there was clearly one was so much better. So I was not a huge fan of this. I don't really remember it too well either. It was fairly forgettable, whereas Paying the Land is like seared in my mind. So the next one that we read was yet another work of nonfiction. This is The Photographer, and it's done by 3 people. So we've got Emmanuel Guibert, Didier Lefebvre, who's the one that the book is about. And then I can't find the other guy's first name, but his last name is Le Mercier. So they're French, can you tell? So this is about Lefebvre going into Afghanistan in the 80s when it is at war with the Soviet Union. And he goes in to accompany Doctors Without Borders, and he is documenting it and taking pictures. So the book combines comics with photography. And this was so fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Again, why didn't I keep it? I was like trying to save space. I was like, I don't know if I'll read it again. Now I'm like, I want to read it again. Bummer. Oh well. Anyway, so the art paired with the photographs was just so interesting. And while we do get like a lot of Lefebvre's development as a person, we also have this real focus on the area and the people there and kind of the horrors they're going through. I was supposed to write a paper on this, and I was actually going to be talking about the times when photographs aren't used and when instead of like, you know, comics, it's just darkness. Because there are a few times of that in the book. But I ultimately didn't write the paper. This semester was really rough. I love this class, but this semester was so bad. I was extremely ill. And like being awake for class was just hard for me. Like getting myself into campus was so difficult. And as soon as I got home, I would have to go to bed. So I was really struggling, and I approached my professor to ask for an extension on the paper, and she was like, Elizabeth, I know you're having a hard time. You don't have to do it. I was like, oh my God, thank you so much. Because even though I had an idea, I have notes and an outline and everything on it here on my computer, but I just like, I couldn't anymore. And what point of the semester was this? Yeah, this was right at the beginning of November. So it's like, that's always the hardest part. The beginning of November is the hardest part of the semester. There's just so much going on. And then to add illness on top of it I am so grateful to that professor for how, actually both my professors this semester were so kind and understanding to me. I'm so grateful to both of them. But yeah, so should have written a paper on the photographer. I didn't. Now we finally get to one that I actually have the physical copy of, and this was another one of my favorites of the semester. This is The Best We Could Do by T. Bui. This is about Bui's, again, another nonfiction. It is a memoir. It is about her family's experience immigrating from Vietnam during the war to the US. And this is really about family trauma, generational trauma, how it gets passed down. Oh, this is such a good book. And it's all kind of like framed around the birth of Bui's first child, which is of course bringing up all of these issues of family trauma for her. This book is marvelous. I wrote a paper and did a presentation, and they were both on the same thing, and it was about Bui's use of the color orange. So you can kind of tell from the fonts on here, but it may not seem like it, but the entire book, the only colors are orange. So it's black, white, and then this rust orange that is darker or lighter at varying points. And so I was like, why orange? And that's literally the title of the presentation and the paper, why orange? I argued that she used this color because of the themes of war trauma and family history. Orange, it looks a lot like blood in some of these scenes. And of course there is also Agent Orange, which was a herbicide used during the war that really really was horrible stuff. And while it itself is not an orange color, it is called Agent Orange. So I argued that the color is connected to trauma of war, as well as the issue of family history, because in an interview she called the color kind of dusty and old. It's like almost a rust color. I argued that her use of the color orange shows how the trauma of war affects the family and continues affecting the family even after the war. It still taints, and it's tainting the next generation. So I loved this book so much. I had such a good time writing about it and presenting on it and making my presentation for it. I wish I could show you the slides because they were pretty top-notch slides. But yeah, highly recommend this one if this sounds like something you'd enjoy. So good. The next book that we read is another graphic memoir. This is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, and then who worked with him on it is Justin Eisinger, Stephen Scott, and the art is by Harmony Becker. So yes, George Takei, Star Trek, George Takei. This is about his childhood in the Japanese internment camps in the US during World War II. I loved this. This was so good. I made my parents read it, or at least my mom. I don't know if my dad did. I did not have to write a paper or do a presentation on this one, but this was just such a good story. It's a part of history that I don't really know much about because in the US we try to shove that under the rug. Actually, the Vietnam War is also something I don't know much about because again, we just kind of try to, shuffle all that under the rug because we don't look very good. So it was so interesting to read. And it's cool that it's the Star Trek guy, but highly recommend this as well. So the final book was actually the least favorite that I read of this class. And this is This How You See Me by Jamie Hernandez. This is a fictional story. It follows two women who are going to a reunion of their punk scene that they were in high school. So we kind of have dual timelines again. We have the reunion when they're adults, and then we have, I think, the late 70s when they're teenagers. And I didn't like this at all. I was not a huge fan of the artwork, but my main issue was the sexualization of women's bodies. And this is something we discussed quite a lot in class because at first a lot of people didn't realize that Jamie Hernandez is a man, not a woman. So the story is really focused on these two women, one of whom I believe is a lesbian and then one of whom I believe is bisexual, who is married to a man but has had relationships with women. And there's just a lot of sexualization of their bodies. And I wasn't a fan, and other people in the class weren't fans either. But those who didn't realize Hernandez was a guy were willing to be like, well, I mean, if this is a lesbian or bi woman and that's how she is portraying things, and maybe this is based on some of her experience, but no, it's a man. So, yeah. And I'm not a prude either. I don't mind. I read some smutty stuff, okay? I read some smutty comics. And graphic novels. That doesn't bother me. It was just the way it was framed felt gross to me. So I was not a fan of this one, and there was no paper or anything on it because at this point we were working on our final paper. So let's jump into the final paper. So I wrote my final paper on this very short, I guess it's a graphic short story called Dear Woman, a Vignette. Is by Elizabeth LaPonce and illustrated by Jonathan R. Thunder, who are both Indigenous authors. LaPonce is Anishinaabe and Métis, and Thunder is Anishinaabe. So Deer Woman is actually a folkloric figure from multiple tribes, and she's generally a beautiful woman with deer legs who seduces men away from their community, and then depending on what version of the story you're hearing, she might stomp the men to death. And then sometimes the men just become sick. I like the one where they get stomped to death, personally. But, you know. So they take this idea of Deer Woman and they put her in a modern setting and Deer Woman is born basically because a woman is sexually assaulted. And so she decides, I'm not going to let that happen to anybody else. And she is then able to like transform into this deer woman. It's a deer woman. I don't know what else to say. And she goes around protecting Indigenous women. It's a super short story, but it's so well done. I highly recommend you go and look it up. It is so good. Anyway, I argued that Deer Woman meets all of the requirements to be considered a superhero. So, of course, you know, comics, superheroes are a very big piece, and we were talking a bit about them throughout the semester, even though we didn't actually read any superhero stories. So, I decided to argue that Le Pensée and Thunder transform this folkloric figure into a superhero who is specifically there to protect Indigenous women, who are considerably more likely to be sexually assaulted or trafficked. There was a whole part at the end of the short story that gave actual facts about it. I had so much fun writing this paper. This is honestly probably my favorite paper I've ever written because it was just so enjoyable. Like, yes, some of the stuff was very heavy, but I just genuinely liked doing the research for it and looking at the art and examining it. And actually, I mean, writing this one was pretty good compared to how writing some of my other papers is, okay? Look, I'm always like, I hate writing as I'm in a literature PhD. I don't like the act of writing. It's hard for me. I like coming up with the ideas and researching them and thinking about them. But then I'm like, why do I have to put it on paper? I have it in my head. Why can't you figure it out from in my head? But then once I have written the paper, I look back on it. I'm like, wow, that's such a good paper. Good job, me. Good job. So I did really enjoy working on this paper. It's one that I'm very proud of. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything I actually do, but that's okay. And I think that is actually one of my favorite things about this course is it was so far removed from my actual scholarly interests that it didn't feel quite as much like work as it does when I'm like, this is my field and I should be thinking about turning this into a journal article. I was like, no, I'm just gonna read some comics and be like, hey, why is this orange being used? So it was just a fun way to really explore a genre that I love but have never studied. So that is my graphic narrative course. I can't remember what the actual title was. I've always just called it graphic narrative. Reading in all directions, comic and graphic narrative. Graphic narrative. Really fantastic course with a really amazing professor. Great reading list. You know, there's a few that I didn't like. That's normal. But so many 4- and 5-star reads. So, that was the first class of fall 2020. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of these? What did you think of them? Have you ever taken a graphic narrative class? What did you read for it? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.